Those songs actually go along with the title of my sermon today so you'll see that as we go on here. I do have a humorous story, I think, to share in regard to comments that Bill made yesterday about the CDs that I had made a few years back. I was in Colorado for, camp or some reason after I had made these CDs, and different people had them and stuff. And this lady from Denver, she's a really nice lady. I really like her. And she had gotten my CDs, and she came up to me, and she was trying to be nice. She was being complimentary and stuff. In her mind, she was paying me a great compliment. But it was humorous because she said, I got your CDs, and I play them for my granddaughter, her little granddaughter, 4 or 5 or something. She says she just goes right to sleep when she hears those CDs. So, yeah, I think it does sometimes. I fall asleep up here at the pulpit. So the text, as Bill brought out, we were talking in this sermon about not grumbling or complaining, as it says in verse 8, verse 10, do not grumble as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. So he's talking about a historical fact from the time that Israel spent and actually ended up wandering in the desert because of this very thing, this problem. And just to kind of put it in context of what was going on here, Israel, as you remember, the 10 plagues in Egypt, all 10 of them, and the people of God were not, they were in the country of Egypt there, and I've always wondered how it was, because all the plagues happened to the people of Egypt, but did not happen to the people of God. Have you ever wondered what that looked like? Did they look over and see this wall of hail coming down and killing the cattle? Or what about the darkness? How did that work? It's perfectly light where the Israelites were, but it was pitch black where the Egyptians were? I've always wondered what that was like. But quite a feat. 10 major miracles that the people of God had seen, and finally Pharaoh said, get out of here. We don't want you here anymore, and the people of Egypt wanted them out so badly, they were giving them their stuff to help them on their way. And so, as you might remember, they've traveled through the desert for a few days here, and Pharaoh changes his mind again. He says, I want those people back. Man, this guy was a hard-headed guy for sure. But God's people, the Israelites, had made it up to the shore of the Red Sea, and they look back and they see Pharaoh and all of his Egyptian army coming. And granted, again, they've just seen these 10 major miracles that God has performed, these 10 plagues. They've seen God's power working through that. And they've seen the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. They know that God is with them, and they're clearly within the will of God as they're traveling, and He is protecting them. But now they find themselves backed up on this plain right on the seashore, and there's no way to get out. They're hemmed in by the mountains. They're hemmed in by the water. And here is Pharaoh's army coming down the valley. What are we going to do? And in Exodus chapter 14, verse 10 says, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord, and they said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians? I don't know. I don't think it's recorded that they said that, but it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. And God, being the merciful God and gracious God that he is, what did he do? Well, he performs another major miracle. And he delivers them from that problem, that trouble, and they walk through the sea on dry land. And I've wondered what that looked like too. To see the water piled up. I think the scripture says that God made the water pile up on both sides of them, and they walked through on dry land. Wonder how that felt. Then they get to the other side and they turn around and the water comes crashing back, and so long for Pharaoh's army. So now there's another major deliverance that they have seen, another major provision from God. And then we tune back in Exodus chapter 15, verse 22. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. 3 days, says. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That's why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" Oh boy. How's God going to handle this one? We don't have any water to drink. Does God realize that? I mean, he just got done with 10 plagues. He just got done dividing the Red Sea. But we don't have any water to drink. Grumble, grumble, complain. And as we know, God provided them water. They got a piece of wood and threw it in the water, and it was fit to drink. And then a little while later, we find them in Exodus chapter 16, verse 2. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt." Man, they get down at the mouth pretty quickly, don't they? If only we had died, if God had just killed us in Egypt. There, oh, lovely Egypt. We sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. I think Egypt was growing in their minds. It was getting better and better. It seemed like their memories were getting warped. We sat around pots of meat. You could just feel it. These great big feasts that were all around them. That's what they were thinking about. They ate everything they wanted. But Moses, you took us away from that and you brought us out here in the desert to starve. We're going to starve to death. Forget about the fact that God sent 10 plagues and delivered us. Forget about the fact that he divided the sea and delivered us. Forget about the fact that he miraculously cleaned up the water so that we could drink. Now we're going to die. So they forgot about the slavery, I guess, that little tidbit of a detail. And I'm not going to take time to read through the rest of the accounts, but you can, time after time after time, the Israelites grumble and complain against Moses and against Aaron. And they cry out, "God, why did you bring us out here? Moses, why did you bring us out here? We wish we could go back to Egypt." And time after time, God delivers them. He gives them water. He gives them food. He gives them manna. And then after a while, what do we find them doing? Complaining about the manna, right? We're sick of this stuff. It's just sweet and whatever. We're getting tired of this manna. God sends them quail, and it's kind of funny because he said, "You're going to eat quail till it comes out your nostrils," I think he said. And the Bible says that he sent quail, sent a wind to blow the quail in from the ocean, and the way it says it's 3 feet deep. I wasn't quite sure if the way it was worded, if it meant that the quail were flapping around in the air 3 feet off the ground so they could get it, or if it was 3 feet deep, but I think it was piled up on the ground because there was so much quail. God said, "Fine, you're tired of the manna? I'm going to give you something to eat. Here you go." Complain, complain, grumble, grumble. And you know, the icing on the cake is when they all started flopping around on the ground and crying and whining because they said, "Oh, we can't go into the promised land," because 10 of the 12 people came back and said, "There's giants. God doesn't know how to deliver us from giants." He only knows how to deal with cattle and water and food, I guess, but he doesn't know anything about giants. There's giants in the land. We can't go in. I can just see rolling around on the ground, crying and whining. We can't make it. And God finally said, okay, that's enough. You people are going to die in the wilderness, and there's going to be a new generation that's going to get to go in the promised land besides Joshua and Caleb, who said we can do it, and they got to do it. But then our text says that these things occur as an example, or they function as an example for us to see what God thinks about grumbling and complaining. That said, they were killed by the destroying angel. There were different times God used different methods, but several of them, thousands, tens of thousands of them perished because of their grumbling. You know what I find is that we seem to be naturally negative. We seem to be naturally negative. And it starts right from first learning to speak. What's the number one word that babies learn to say? No. That's a consensus from all the parents. No. They learn that far sooner than yes. Maybe even sooner than mama. They learn no. We are naturally negative. In our society, it's the scandal that grabs our attention, right? You go through the checkout line at Walmart, and you can see all these magazines, and there's just headline after headline that this person and this marriage is breaking up, and this person was seen out with this other person, and it just goes on and on and on. That's what makes the juicy news. We tend to look at our situations in life from a negative viewpoint. And when it comes to the actions and the speech of others, we tend to first assume the worst about other people, don't we? We don't know the whole story, but what do? We assume the worst. Why does that come so naturally? Why don't we just naturally assume the best? Well, that takes work of the Spirit of God in our lives, but that's what we need to work toward. We also tend to be forgetful. How often did Israel forget what had gone before? I'd like to think that I would not have been one of those so quickly forgetting what God had done and whining and complaining. I'd like to think that, but I don't know. Because they weren't particularly bad or weird people. They were people just like you and me. Maybe I would have been one of those forgetting and complaining, because I do forget and I do complain. The Israelites only remembered the food. They forgot the slavery. They only thought of the thirst. And they forgot that God had taken care of them time after time. They only thought of how often that they had to eat the same thing, the manna or the quail. They forgot that they had no food, and God gave them some. We tend to be negative. We tend to forget. We complain, and we grumble, and it's a problem. God sent his destroying angel to kill a bunch of them. And God doesn't like it anymore today. I'm glad he doesn't always send his destroying angel when we complain and grumble. But it is a lesson to us about what he thinks. And so what I want us to get first of all, why is complaining a problem? I want us to get this. The problem with complaining is that when you criticize or complain, you are acting as if you could run the world better than God does. You're acting as if you could run the world better than God. Because God's in charge of it. And he allows this to happen. He allows that to happen. He causes this. He causes that. And he's in control of all the mechanisms. And what we're saying is, you know what, God, if you just step back and let me handle this for a little bit, I'd do a little bit better job. We have a very limited human perspective. Very, very limited. You know, God could pull back the curtain on what he's doing. He could pull back the curtain and he could say, this is what I'm doing. But I'm not sure if we'd even understand it then. But he could do that. He could pull back the curtain and show us everything he's doing and why he does this and why he allows that to happen. He could do that, but he has designed us to live by faith, not by sight. We don't need to have the curtain pulled back because we can't run the world better than God, and we don't need to know everything because we couldn't handle it if we did know. All we need to do is trust God day by day, step by step, because that's what we've been designed to do. When we complain, we're challenging God's wisdom. Do you really know what you're doing? You know, when I say that, I don't like to think of myself complaining because I think I'd never challenge God's wisdom. I know he's smarter than me. But then I'll turn around and this afternoon I'll find myself complaining about something. Well, that's what we're doing. When we complain, we're doubting God's care. We're doubting God's care. Do you really love me? Do you really care for me? When we complain, we're forgetting God's goodness. I'm focusing on what I don't have rather than what I have. You know what we need to do? We need to acknowledge the sovereignty of God in our lives. God is God. I'm not. He is sovereign. He runs things, I don't, and I accept that in my life. That is what we need to do. Now, another thing I want to talk about is the reality of what God is doing in our lives. Now, there's innumerable things that God is trying to do in each of our lives on any given day, and we can't hope to know or talk about. But in a general sense, there's a couple things that I want to bring up about what does God try to do in us? What does he do in us if we let him? And the truth of life is that we go through seasons. There are seasons of life. We go through seasons where everything is great and everything is running smoothly. And we go through seasons of pain. Can you raise your hand if you've gone through a season of pain in your life? Has anybody not gone through a season of pain in their life? That's the truth of life. There are seasons. You've been there. Maybe you're there now. You feel isolated. Maybe you feel alone and you're saying, maybe you're asking, where is God in this? I don't understand what's going on. I don't understand why God would allow this. It does not seem like something that God would allow, and I don't understand it. Maybe you're asking that. The reality is that oftentimes God is right there, and he's doing a deep work inside of you. It's a little bit like the little bird that was flying south for the winter. And this little birdie's flying south for the winter, and he got off to a late start, and he got caught in a snowstorm. And the snow and the sleet was so fierce that it got on his little wings, and they started to freeze, and all of a sudden he just came in for a crash landing. Couldn't fly anymore, and the little birdie was just being pelted. And he realized his wings were frozen, and he couldn't fly, and he was so cold, huddled there, and shivering, and there was nothing he could do. No recourse, nothing that he could do for himself. And so he just resigned himself to his fate, and he said, I'm going to freeze to death. This is just the worst thing ever. Then all of a sudden, a cow came along and stood over the little birdie, and he dumped on him. A whole load of manure falls on this little bird, and the bird says, I thought it was bad before. I was going to freeze to death. Now I'm under this manure. It's the worst thing ever. Do you know what happened? Well, the warmth of the manure started to cause his little frozen body to thaw out. And suddenly he starts to have a little hope, and he starts to flap his wings again, and he was so excited, and he started to chirp with joy. I might live, I might live, I might live. Chirp, 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 chirp. This is great. And out of nowhere, a cat showed up and heard the chirping and ate the little bird. I know that probably starting in a couple of hours you'll already be beginning to forget what I've said, but I bet you don't forget this illustration. So there's 3 lessons that hopefully will tag onto this illustration in your mind and you'll remember them. And the lesson number 1 is not everyone who drops manure on you is your enemy. Lesson number 2, not everyone who digs you out of the manure is necessarily your friend. And lesson number 3, maybe this is the most important one. When you're in the manure, keep your mouth shut. Now, you'll forget the rest of the sermon, but I hope if you remember that, then we'll have something accomplished here. When you're in the manure, keep your mouth shut. And some of you right now, you'd say, man, I am in the manure. I'm there. I'm being broken. It's like I'm being cut down. And things I used to depend on, I can't depend on them anymore. They're not there for me anymore. And God may say, no, you've got to understand, I'm doing something in you. I'm doing something in you. There's preparatory work going on. I'm teaching you something that you couldn't learn any other way. That's what I'm doing. And I'm doing this work in you so that I can do more through you in the future. Some of you, you're there. You're there, and I'm saying be there on purpose, understanding this work of God. A.W. Tozer, the great writer, said this. He said, it's doubtful that God can bless a man greatly until he's hurt him deeply. It's doubtful that God can bless a man greatly until he's hurt him deeply. So when you're in a season of pain, be encouraged. The more that God breaks you, the more God is preparing you, because he's not done with you. He's training you. He's preparing you for something even greater that he has on the horizon. Or maybe you're in a season where there's something that you used to trust in for your security, and it's been taken away. Has anybody ever been there? I would say there's many of us that have been there. Something that we've always trusted in, or that we've always relied on to some extent for our security, and suddenly it's gone. It's not there anymore. And we don't have anything else to trust in other than the giver of life and the giver of all good things. Because all the other things we've trusted in are gone. They're gone. And you're having to learn that when everything else goes away, God is still faithful. And when everything else does go away, when everything else that you believe in goes away, God will forever and always be faithful to you. You know, a single mom knew this very well. She would pray every day very loudly in her apartment. She would pray to God, and she would ask him and worship him for his provision. And she lived right next door to an atheist. And this atheist, he hated hearing her prayers every day through the thin walls, and he was getting sick and tired of that. And she would worship God, and she would pray, and the atheist would come over and he said, "Lady, you're a fool. There is no God. Don't you understand that?" And one time there was more month left than there was money, and this single mom was crying out to God, "Oh God, you've always provided for me. You've always been there for me. You've always been faithful, and I know that you will come through again. God, please provide food for my children." And this atheist had had enough. Was tired of it. He said, "Okay, I'm going to show her. I'm going to show her. And so he went to the grocery store and he bought a whole bunch of food, several bags of food, and he brought it back to the woman's apartment and put it right in front of her door. And then he knocked on it, rang the doorbell, and then ran around the corner and hid. And she came out and she said, God in heaven, you are so good. You're so amazing. I love you so much. And the atheist, I got her now, he jumps out from around the corner and he said, you fool, there is no God. God didn't do that. He didn't bring it to you. I did, just to prove to you that there is no God. And this lady, she worshiped God all the more. She said, oh God, not only did you provide for my needs, you made the devil pay the bill. So forever and always, God says, I will be your provider. When you can't depend on what you've always depended on, when whatever that is suddenly isn't there anymore, I am. And I will deliver you. And it gives you enough for a day at a time. Some of you, you're learning that right now. You're in a season where you're hurting and you're alone and you're afraid, but guess what? God delivers enough for the day. You're uncomfortable and you're afraid, but God says, I will be your comfort for today. You don't have much, but God says, I will be your provision for today. You feel very weak. God says, I will be your strength for today. Your friends leave you, but God says, I will be your friend for the day. And I may not bring you more than you need, but I will bring you exactly what you need. And you can learn to depend on God for that day. And God is teaching you. He's breaking you. He's cutting you. He's humbling you. He's teaching you total dependence because that's where we need to live. That's where we need to live, is in total dependence. And I don't like that process. It's not fun. If God gave me a choice, I'd probably say I'll pass. Fortunately, he doesn't give me a choice because he loves me too much and he sends me through the experiences of life so that I learn total dependence on him. God is saying there is so much more that I want to do in you. There's so much more that I want to do through you. And when you have no ability to provide for yourself, God is teaching you, I will always be your provider. And now I want to move on to the next thought and talk for just a little bit on how our attitudes and perspectives should change in light of everything that we've been talking about so far. What should our attitude be? What should our perspective be? Well, first of all, we should learn to be thankful. Learn to be thankful. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 18. Can anyone quote that? Give thanks in all circumstances, right? For why? Because this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. God says, I want you to be thankful in all circumstances. Now, it doesn't say, I want you to be thankful for all circumstances. You're not going to be thankful for the circumstances sometimes. They'll feel pretty bad, but God says you can be thankful in the circumstances. I know that God is working all things for good. He has a pattern. And he fits even the bad things of our lives into that pattern for good in a way that only God can do. God's purpose for my life is far bigger than my problems. So I can give thanks to him in every situation. You know, I need to learn to be grateful for what I have. We all need to learn to be grateful for what we have. And I know we say that so much that sometimes it becomes cliche, right? But we need to learn to truly be grateful for what God has done for us. It's a tremendous antidote for complaining. Whenever we're complaining, typically we're being ungrateful. The truth is, you can focus on either the negative or the positive. Is the cup half empty or is it half full? Well, it depends on how you look at it. And why is it that we often don't value what we have in life until it's gone? Family members don't get together and see each other until there's a funeral, right? And I've heard them. We should have done this before now. You don't value what you have until it's gone. You know, we in America have so much to be grateful for, and yet we take it for granted. At home, my wife has this decorative plate that's sitting on the counter by the stove, and it has a saying that she got the plate in typical man fashion. I guess I didn't pay close attention to it for a while until she pointed it out and said, "Did you read that statement?" Well, I hadn't, but I looked at it then and it caught me, and I've thought about it a lot since then. And it says, the things that we take for granted are the things someone else is praying for. The things that we take for granted are the things that someone else is praying for. They wish they had it. They're asking God to provide it. But we have it all the time and we take it for granted. You know, recently we had to move. And after 11 years of accumulating stuff, some of it probably falls under the term junk. 11 years of accumulation, we had way too much stuff. And you know, I've been dreading the day. I didn't know we'd be moving this year, but in the past years, whenever I thought about the fact that someday we would have to move, I was dreading that day because of the stuff that we had. And so it finally came time to move. I thought, man, we have so much stuff. And I'm dreading this. But you know what? The other side of that is I can complain about having to move or complain about this, but the truth is I've been given so much. I have stuff to move. There are some people that could move by simply walking out the door and going somewhere else, and that would be moving for them. I have stuff to move. I should be grateful. We needed to temporarily live in the basement of a family member's house up there in the Twin Cities, and we were immensely happy that we could go there, but we also thought from time to time, man, I don't really want to live in a basement. Then we thought, well, we have family to go to. In this case, it was physical family, but we have lots of church family. I would have done the same thing. You know, we have family. We have a place to go. You know, there are a lot of people in this world that literally have nowhere. If they have to leave where they're at, they have nowhere to go. And in my years in the ministry and having people contact me for help from the church, I've become more and more aware of that. You know, I'm so used to having family. I'm so used to having church where I'm surrounded by people that I could turn to. I'm used to that, and I take it for granted. And there's some people out there that are literally on their own. They have no one to turn to. And if for some reason they can't make it on their own, they're in trouble. And that's how they end up on the streets or trying to find a place in a shelter. I need to be grateful. Because of where Patrick and Corinne lived, was going to require a tremendous amount of driving, particularly on my part, because the Twin Cities is a pretty big place, and they lived on one side, and I worked on the other side, and the kids go to school on yet another side. And so I did my share of grumbling about the fact that every day I kind of had to make this circuit in a van that gets like, I don't know, 1.5 miles a gallon. And it's like, you know, it leaks about every fluid that it can possibly. And me being who I am, I don't take it in and repair all that stuff. I just dump fluid in it. But I'm grumbling about that. And then I'm thinking, but I have a car to drive. I have a van to drive. It does drive. It's not the most desirable one, but it drives, right? There are people that don't have that. I need to be thankful. Of course, there are things in your life that you're not satisfied with. There's some things in your marriage that you don't like, things in your business, habits in yourself, habits in your mate, your children, your boss. But I believe there are also things in those situations and in things in those people that you could learn to be thankful for. If you saw the cup as half full rather than half empty. And that is being grateful. That is being thankful. And the Bible says as Christians, we should be different. It says in Philippians chapter 2, beginning in verse 14, Philippians chapter 2, beginning in verse 14, do everything without what? Complaining or arguing or murmuring, as your translation says. Same thing. Do everything without that. Why? So that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a crooked and depraved generation in which you shine like stars in the universe. Don't you love that word picture? You know, we have a lot of light in the Twin Cities, so you don't necessarily get super dark nights right there then, but if you drive outside of town and you look up and it's dark, I was thinking driving back to Tony and Melody's last night, it's dark. That's what you get in the country, and it's nice, but you look up and there's stars. Last night there weren't, but there's clouds, but you can look up in the dark night sky and you see stars and they're shining brightly in the blackness. And that's what we're supposed to be as Christians. And that Paul uses that in connection with, don't you be grumblers and complainers. Instead, learn to be thankful and grateful. And that makes you so different from everyone else that you shine like a star in the universe. Brother Dave was talking earlier about evangelism and how he didn't feel like he was particularly good at it. And I imagine there's probably a lot of us that may share that sentiment. But you know what? All we have to do is not grumble and complain, and we become evangelists right there, right? That's what Paul says. Admittedly, many of us probably feel like we're not that great in going up and just talking to people. And that's okay. There are many things we can do. Just by having the right attitude, we become witnesses for the Lord. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 11, Paul says, I've learned to be content whatever the circumstances. Remember the forgiveness that's been extended to you. Remember how God has forgiven you. Remember the patience that has been shown to you. Remember in time past how God has come through for you. Remember the freedom that you've been given to come here today and worship. Remember your health, which could be much worse. Remember the future that God has promised us. And another thing about our attitude is we need to look for God's hand in circumstances. We need to look for God's hand in circumstances. If you want to get the victory over complaining, you do this. You begin to look for how God is working. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 17 and 18, this small and temporary trouble that we suffer will bring us a tremendous and eternal glory, much greater than the trouble. Whatever it is we're going through right now is going to produce something in us much greater than the trouble that we're going through. So we fix our attention not on the things that are seen, but on the things that are unseen. What is seen lasts only for a time, but what cannot be seen lasts forever. So Paul is saying that there are problems that come into our lives, there's no doubt, but the way that you look at them determines your attitude. Because God is working these things in your life for good. And the good that you're going to get out of them will be much more long-lasting than the problem. And the problem is so temporary in the big picture. So you look for God's hand in the circumstances. See, positive people realize that God is controlling circumstances. God is fitting everything into a pattern, and his purpose is greater than your problem. Another thing is for us to practice speaking positively. Practice saying positive words. You know, my wife is into psychology, about to graduate with her counseling psychology degree, and you know, the kids and sometimes me will say things negatively about ourselves or something like that, and she'll say, "Don't talk like that. That's not true. That's not the truth about yourself." And other psychological examinations that go on inside our home. But you know, there's truth in this, that the words you say reinforce patterns in your mind. That's the truth. And they reinforce things that you think about yourself. They reinforce things you think about others and things that you think about your situation. And so you should practice speaking positively. Practice saying positive things. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29, it turns out, agrees. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouth, it says, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. Don't let unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but let stuff come out that is fitting for building up, for encouraging, for benefit. Replace your criticisms and your complaints with compliments. And our culture is so negative. When you find somebody who's positive, genuinely, they'll stick out like a sore thumb. Like those stars we were talking about. Somebody who is up at the mouth instead of down at the mouth, who says nice things and encouraging things, will stick out. Paul says that Christians are to react differently to the circumstances in life. A positive Christian is a good witness. And I want you to think also that a negative Christian is a bad witness. It goes both ways. Let's have an impact for the positive. Be positive in a negative world. And I want us to also remember that God sees the big picture. God sees the big picture. And up here on this screen, there's a picture. Do you see it? Nobody sees it? You're not looking good enough. Keep looking. Well, it's actually covered. Uh-oh. There is a picture there, I promise you. Because I gave it to Jason. And it's there. And it's off. Told you. Does anybody have any idea what this picture is of?
Sunset.
Okay. Well, what does it look like now? Got some sky, got a little bit of rock there. How about now? Well, let's bring up something else. Looks a lot like the other one on the other side, so got some landscape there. That's a pretty good guess. Who said that? Good job. Well, you know what? That's what this is. But this is life. God sees this whole picture. It's all complete to him. There's nothing hidden to him. He sees it. But we see it one piece at a time. And maybe we don't ever get to see the whole picture. But it comes one part at a time. And how does that fit here? Because God is redeeming the world to himself. He is redeeming you and me to himself. That is what he is doing in our lives. That's what the cross accomplished. And that's what God is doing bit by bit in our lives. And we can know that. And when we first see just that one little picture and we think, oh, it's a sunset, and indeed it is a little bit of a sunset there, but that's not the whole picture, right? But God sees the whole thing, and we don't. But what we can know and trust by faith is that God is doing that in our lives, and God is doing that in other people's lives. We may not understand it. We may not know why things go the way they are, but God is bringing his redeeming work in his church and in this world, bit by bit. So I want to conclude with this verse. Colossians chapter 2, verses 6 and 7 says, "So then, just as you received Christ Jesus as Lord, continue to live in him, rooted and built up in him, strengthened in the faith as you were taught, and overflowing with thankfulness." Thank you for your attention. Bill, I'll turn it back over to you.